Hello, my name is Paige Hector and I am an advanced practice social worker. Welcome to the video series titled Trauma-Informed Care in the Long-Term Care Organization. I have worked in the post-acute and long-term care setting for almost 30 years, and I'm very passionate about a number of topics, including trauma-informed care, clinical operations, and process improvement. I write columns for two well-known publications and am involved in several national work groups and committees. My bio is available at the end of this presentation. This is a list of our video series. In this session, we will be talking about the foundation of trauma-informed care. And in this presentation today, we are going to cover trauma definitions and sources, concepts like triggers and re-traumatization. I'll give an overview of trauma-informed care, universal precautions, the regulations, some principles of trauma-informed care that are the foundation of this work, and we'll end with facility assessment. So when you think of the word trauma, what do you think of? That's a pretty big word, and usually what people think of are things like you might see in this image. So things from natural disasters and catastrophes and abuse and neglect and some pretty horrific things. There are many different sources of trauma, and I will get to those. Before we do that, I want to provide a couple of just general definitions. So I want to point out that CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, they do use this particular trauma definition. It says that individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. And if we were just to stop right there, I want to point out that we are talking about trauma that can be a result of one single event, a series of events over a period of time, or circumstances. So the definition of trauma is actually quite broad. The individual might experience these events as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and there's some indication of lasting adverse effects on their well-being. Throughout this entire video series, I would like to invite you to think about not just the residents and the patients that you care for, but also yourselves, because trauma-informed care includes all of us. It includes everyone that lives in your community, that works in your community, that visits your community. So emotional and psychological trauma is the result of extraordinarily stressful events that leave you feeling helpless. Often there's a threat to your life or safety, feelings of overwhelm, isolation, feeling frightened and helpless. And the more that we feel those emotions, the more likely it is that we are to be traumatized. And yet a third specific category of trauma is medical trauma. Medical traumas are psychological traumas that result from medical diagnoses or interventions. And whenever I talk about medical trauma, I always use the caveat, this is a very tender place, I think, for healthcare workers, because I think all of us would say we would never, ever think of coming to work to traumatize someone, that we come to work to provide care and loving care for people. But the reality is that a lot of the things that we do as healthcare staff can, in fact, be perceived as traumatic. So this is a very tender place for us to be talking about, but obviously we're coming through this pandemic. This is a very, very important topic. There's lots of sources of medical trauma, and I'm going to provide a few slides with some examples. Basically, it's interactions with the system, and I put that in a quotation. I think we all kind of understand what that means, that healthcare in general can be a very complicated thing to interact with at any level, whether it's in a nursing home or acute care setting or home health, that there are complications with that, and sometimes that can be very traumatic for some people. Communication that's too technical or too vague, too little or too much. Side effects of medication, procedures like placing an IV or a catheter, being exposed to particular sounds or light or smells, stimulation, fearing for one's life and well-being. So there are so many different ways that a person can experience feelings of trauma or stress related to trauma. The ICU is a unique setting, a definite potential source of trauma. Obviously, in the ICUs, most patients will undergo things like sedation, sometimes restraints, depending on the situation. Good likelihood of being intubated, a lot of light, there's a lot of noise and kind of chaos, and it's very isolating. And what we know from the research is that over 80% of mechanically ventilated ICU patients will experience delirium. So delirium is a clear predictor of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a 18 to 34% of individuals after receiving ICU care that are actually diagnosed with full-on post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Additional sources of trauma include any type of abuse or assault, neglect, poverty, and homelessness, attachment injuries, the loss of roles, institutionalization and loss of mobility, and basically any loss of control or function. Things like bullying, shaming, discrimination, racism, exposure to substance use or imprisonment, generational trauma. And what we mean by that is people either directly or through a generation or a family legacy or history being exposed to things like the Holocaust. Perhaps there's grandchildren and their grandparents were in the concentration camps, or people who have relatives, grandparents that were slaves at one point in time. So that's a generational trauma that can continue year after year and become part of a family legacy that very much is a lot of times associated with trauma. Natural disasters and accidents, injuries, disability, war, torture, acts of terrorism. And look at that last one on there, witnessing any of those. That's really important, that we can be traumatized even by not directly being involved in any of these. Additional sources of trauma are aging and illness, especially cancer. Post-traumatic stress disorder signs and symptoms, nearly 20% in early stage cancer, and look at that, 80% with recurrent cancer. Just generally, an overview of losses related to aging and illness. You know, as we get older and as things change and perhaps we need more assistance with our activities of daily living or instrumental ADLs, finances, perhaps we've experienced the death of a partner or a spouse and the loss of meaningful roles. There are so many different ways that people can experience loss related to aging and illness that can be considered traumatic. My co-partner and co-presenter with this trauma series, Barbara Ganzel, this is years ago, I was actually listening to her give a presentation. And she said, you know, we cannot discount things just because they're common. And that really spoke to me, that I think in nursing homes, we become accustomed to seeing people who are struggling with the loss of function and illnesses. And we might think, well, this is just common, that we may forget or not realize or appreciate the impact of those illnesses and those losses upon that individual because we do see them day in and day out. You know, sometimes in nursing home care, one of the things that we might do is engage in life review. And sometimes that can be a very rewarding activity for people to do. And sometimes it can be traumatic, that when thoughts about mortality and issues that might be painful memories that might trigger feelings of sadness or fear or vulnerability. So while I'm not saying that we shouldn't do life review with people, because that can be very rewarding and a part of a leaving of a legacy, we also want to be aware that doing this can also allow traumas and past regrets and hurts and sadness to bubble up. This is a fascinating concept here, and it really spoke to me when I saw this, when I learned this a few years ago, that, you know, if you take any one of these issues or events individually, for example, a medical crisis, perhaps a hospitalization or a surgery, and in and of itself, it can or may not be traumatic. It really depends on the individual. But then when you start looking at all the different things that have happened in a person's life, what we begin to see is like a pattern. We see how things are connected, that feelings of vulnerability or fear or helplessness related to a medical crisis can be very similar to a childhood event of being bullied, or an event of a divorce or combat. So when you step when you can look above the trees and kind of see what's going on around, it begins to help us to see how events throughout one's life are in fact connected, and how trauma over the course of a lifetime can actually be cumulative. And whether or not the person realizes it, these memories form what's called a memory network. It can be cumulative. So just being aware that what we see with the individual in a nursing facility, in a nursing home at that moment, can be informed by so many different things that have happened over the course of their lifetime. A very important part of trauma-informed care is that trauma is an injury. It is not a weakness. It is not an illness, and it's not a character flaw. It is actually an injury. When we say trigger, what we're talking about is basically anything. A trigger can literally be anything in the environment. It can be a smell or a sound, an emotional state or a feeling, a situation. So basically anything that reminds the individual of a past trauma or traumatic event. And then what happens is our body actually reacts as though it's experiencing that traumatic event all over again, which is what we mean by re-traumatization. Something in the environment that replicates or reminds the individual either literally or symbolically of the original experience. So institutional environments can also feel very dehumanizing. And this is hard because I think, I do believe in my heart that in nursing homes especially, we try very hard to minimize the noise, to be respectful of privacy and routines and that sort of thing. But at the same time, there's a lot of things in these environments that make it feel dehumanizing to people. So we need to be aware of this. And I'm going to be giving lots of suggestions of how to go about, looking at person-centered care and trauma-informed care to help mitigate and reduce some of these. I would be remiss if I did not include a slide about re-traumatization specific to the pandemic. This list is certainly not exhaustive. We could make it much more extensive, but I just wanted to give some ideas of things in the different categories. So if you look here, multisensory, sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, sirens, latex smell, crinkling of gowns, seeing residents alone in rooms. There's a lot of different things that can happen in the environment that can actually trigger or remind us of different aspects of our experience related to the pandemic. Feeling short of breath, a racing heart, claustrophobia from all the personal protective equipment, those might be specifically related to the pandemic. And it goes on. So emotional states, shock, regret, and exhaustion, depression, anxiety, confusion. So when we feel these things in the present moment, it can be reminding us of how we felt earlier in the pandemic, months ago, weeks ago, yesterday, or even this morning. Situations. It's interesting, I'm having dialogues with people around, for so long we've been not permitted or allowed to touch, to hug, or to hold. And now that we see as things are opening up a little bit, I'm actually curious to see if we experience some trauma around that, because for so long we've not been able to hug or to touch residents, but now we're wondering, once we are able to, if we're going to be experiencing some kind of trauma related to that. So triggers, trauma reminders, when those occur, what that can remind us of is, I'm not safe, I cannot protect myself, or I am going to die. Literally, that's what our body and mind are telling us when we feel triggered. Whether it's actually in reality or not, it doesn't matter. That's what our biological stress response is telling us, and that's alerting us to that danger. Here's another resource that's excellent. This is SAMHSA's Concept of Trauma and Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach. So I'll be giving you a lot of resources throughout this video series. And a couple things from this particular resource that spoke to me is that trauma is a widespread, harmful, and costly public health problem. And keep in mind, if you notice the date, 2014, this was way before the pandemic. So now, absolutely what we're seeing is that we are anticipating post-traumatic stress, and post-traumatic stress disorder is definitely, we're anticipating, going to be on the rise. The need to address trauma is increasingly viewed as an important component of effective behavioral health service delivery. So healthcare has been a little bit behind the 8 ball. Other institutions and work settings such as childhood education, juvenile justice, mental health, military, workforce, and government, these places have all been doing a little bit more in the trauma-informed care work space than healthcare. I will say that a few years ago, the end-of-life care National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization began a trauma-informed end-of-life care work group a few years ago. So I was tickled to be a part of that. We've been doing some really good things, helping to bring more awareness of trauma-informed care, specifically in the area of end-of-life care. So let's talk now about what exactly is trauma-informed care. A simple definition. It is the adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. I love the idea of a bridge. So trauma-informed care is like a bridge between our awareness of, yeah, it's important that we have environments that are safe and where people can trust one another and all the principles which I'll talk about, but then how to actually act on that awareness. So it's one thing to have the knowledge, but it's another thing to actually carry it out. So to me, the trauma-informed care is like the bridge between the two. This really spoke to me, another great resource here. A colleague of mine a few years ago said something also that really was important. She said, trauma-informed care is the practice of engaging others, providing care by intentionally considering the impact of their past experiences on their current presentation. So I'll be talking more about that when we talk about trauma-informed care, we're really most focused on how does the individual experience the trauma in their current situation, not necessarily the event itself, but how they're experiencing it currently. Healthcare providers certainly are very familiar, especially with the pandemic, about universal precautions, that we glove and gown no matter the level of hazard. Wonderful analogy here that trauma-informed care, we actually use the same principle, assuming that everyone has a history of trauma. At some point in time that we've all had a history of trauma, that we glove and gown metaphorically, that when we have any interaction with a peer or a colleague, a resident, a patient, a family, a care partner, that we always come approaching the situation with the idea that there could be trauma in this person's background. So approaching with empathy and kindness and openness, with being alert for possible triggers that could re-traumatize the individual. The benefits of trauma-informed care, these slides are in here. So what I might encourage you to do is you begin your own journey of becoming a trauma-informed care culture. It's a journey, it's not a destination. There's so many reasons why this is so important, from increasing the quality of services, reducing unnecessary interventions. There is a potential to reduce hospitalizations, definitely retain staff. There's so much here that's so important, reducing compassion fatigue and burnout, interdisciplinary communication, better teamwork, and one more slide, more effective non-pharmacological, or I would probably say more effective biopsychosocial spiritual interventions, increasing our sense of safety and awareness. So all of these things. So if I were to say to you as healthcare workers, do you think it's important that we have choice and control and we reduce trauma and triggering of people? And of course we would say yes. That's why trauma-informed care is so very important in our healthcare settings. So to recap, trauma-informed care, it's person-centered. It's a perspective. It's an integrative framework. And it's a relational position for everyone who's involved. It's not just for residents, it's for everyone. And it really is a workplace culture. Trauma-informed care is not simply a training on PTSD. it is not based only on the medical model, and I'll talk more about that in the person-centered care segment of this series. It's not a protocol or a set of skills. It's not just for residents, and it's not just for people who have diagnosed with PTSD. So really, it's a culture. It's also a mindset. It's not a tool set. So I'll be talking more about tools, especially when we talk about trauma screening. It's really how we approach the situations, that we seek understanding, that we don't blame or judge or criticize individuals. We try to minimize harm, make it more safe, psychologically and physically safe, providing more choice, and respecting each person's past and how it informs the current situation. So really, this is a paradigm, a way of thinking, a mindset. This is a wonderful resource. I've had it for years, and I do have permission to share it in these presentations. And I just want to point out, it's a lot going on here, but as a handout and as a training tool in your community, over here, this is not trauma-informed. So the list here, it's wonderful. The qualities that are not trauma-informed: power over, judging, people need to be fixed, the concept of there's a right and a wrong to everything, compliance and obedience, I'm here to fix you, it's fear-based. So this is a little bit more of a traditional approach, definitely not trauma-informed. What we're looking at is expanding our capacity to be trauma-informed. Power with, observing, the idea that there is hope for change, learning, empowerment, whole person in history, participatory. And if you'll notice, this is a parenting resource. I think it fits beautifully with the healthcare system as well. So just a great handout to help us understand the different perspectives. Ultimately, one of the most fundamental principles of trauma-informed care, it's a shift from what's wrong with you to what happened. What's wrong to what happened. When we have a resident or a patient in our community that's having a change in perhaps how much they eat, or a change in their cognitive status, or their sleeping or socializing patterns, we tend to look at the medical reasons, which is fine. We want to continue doing that. But we might medicate them, or we might diagnose them, rather than first expanding our questions around, could this be related to trauma? Might there be a connection? So again, this video series is going to uncover, it's going to unpack so much of this right here, but I'm laying the foundation. Of course, we've got to talk about the regulations, and at the time of this video recording, we do not yet have the Phase 3 regulations or the guidance to surveyors yet from CMS. What we know right now is FTAG 699, trauma-informed care. It states, you can see here, the facility must ensure residents who are trauma survivors receive culturally competent trauma-informed care in accordance with professional standards of practice, accounting for residents' experiences, preferences, in order to eliminate or mitigate triggers that may cause re-traumatization of the resident. If you'll notice, that is one sentence. Every time I read it, I am just astounded with how much is packed into that one sentence. There's a lot going on, and there's such wonderful opportunity for us to learn about trauma-informed care. I also want to point out that trauma-informed care is addressed in multiple FTAGs. The whole behavioral health FTAG category, also some of the care plan components, it's just kind of everywhere. It's going to be smattered throughout so many different regulations. I would strongly urge you to take a look at this particular sequence of FTAGs to see how CMS is defining and how the guidance to surveyors is going to be played out. Additional ones, again, these are Phase 3 requirements we do not yet have guidance on, but I want to point out that when you think about communication and resident rights, abuse, neglect, and behavioral health and compliance and ethics, all of these must have elements of the principles of trauma-informed care. So again, encouraging us to see trauma-informed care as a culture, not just a single thing or a single regulation. It's so much more than that. FTAG 675, quality of life. This is truly fundamental, quality of life. Each resident must receive, and the facility must provide necessary care and services, and we've heard this so many times, right, to attain or maintain the highest practicable well-being. When we talk about the highest practicable well-being, I would like to introduce you to a concept of universal human needs. And I'll be talking a lot more about this concept in another video series, but for right now, I want to introduce it to you. I think it's very compatible when we talk about quality of life. The idea of universal human needs is that no matter who we are, no matter our age, our race, our ethnicity, our gender, our sexuality, there's no difference between us as human beings that does not need to have our universal human needs met. So let me show you a list of these. There are many categories on here. I just want to give you a sample of this at the moment. This particular concept is going to come up again in another video topic. I want to point out a couple of the needs in this area here in the middle. Connection. Especially the last over a year and a half now, we've really been disconnected from one another, from our families, from our residents, from their families. As things are changing, the human need for connection, communication, to belong, to be seen and heard and understood. These are profound. These are basic human needs. Look over here under harmony. Peace, tranquility, predictability. Boy, hasn't that been missing the last year and a half. So there's so much going on here. So again, this will come up again, but I wanted to introduce this to you because the next segment of this video is going to talk about the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. All of these are grounded very firmly in our basic universal human needs. So here's an overview. Here's the 6 principles. So I'll go through each of these and give you some prompts, some things to think about. So really, what does safety mean? What is peer support? What does that look like? Safety. So the safe work environment, obviously that includes physical safety, that the physical plant, the place where we live, where residents live and we work, that it's maintained well, that the equipment is safe, that the plant, the facility itself is safe, that we have emergency protocols and policies and procedures in place, disaster planning to help keep us safe, that we have security, that our doors are locked at night, so physical safety. But a trauma-informed care framework actually exceeds the physical safety to include emotional. For example, an emotionally safe nursing home is a place where people can speak up, can disagree with one another respectfully and be heard, that there is zero tolerance for blaming, bullying, and retaliation, that interpersonal communications are safe. So these are just a few elements of what a nursing home, what a safe, a trauma-informed care culture of safety is. A colleague of mine, Dr. Bickle, did a wonderful presentation a while back, and she asked, well, do residents feel safe in your nursing home? And I think instinctively we want to say, well, yes, we take care of people. That's what our job is. And healthcare workers have this purpose and this desire to serve and to care for and to advocate for people. So no doubt we want to create these environments. We instinctively would say that we do this. We need to appreciate that the reality is that some people may not perceive our environments as safe, that we can trigger people. And when we talk more about triggers and how many different ways we can trigger people, I think you'll see how much more complicated trauma-informed care is and how much work we have to do, but we are starting, which is the good news. So trustworthiness and transparency, this is the second principle of trauma-informed care. So qualities of respect and compassion and a desire to be present with another person, even when they are suffering. We are attentive to their comfort. We ask about it. We approach without an agenda, that we really do. This is so many elements that I'm sure you're already seeing the overlap with person-centered care. Predictability with processes and daily activities, that people know what to expect, that we don't just up and surprise them and change things on them. Prioritizing confidentiality and privacy. And we don't have to get it right all the time. I just love that last bullet point. We do not have to get it right all the time, but what we do need is the ability to slow down and acknowledge when something we're doing may not sit well with another person, to talk about it, to bring it out in the open and find solutions together, to collaborate. Peer support is the third principle, and this is really peer support. You know, I talk about it from the resident point of view and the staff point of view. One of the analogies is that peer support can also mean trauma survivors, that when a group of people have experienced a similar event or the same event, each one might have a different relationship with that event or a perception of it. But as a group, the support of one another for people like in your nursing home, there's a camaraderie. You've been through, for example, the pandemic. That when we are around people that share a similar experience with that, there's something very supportive and nurturing and loving about that. Another part of peer support is the use of stories. Human beings by nature are storytellers. We seek to find meaning in everything that happens in our life. So peer support is one way to do that. Peer support, storytelling is very important in the bigger picture of recovery and for healing. The next principle is collaboration and mutuality. Few important points with this, that there's partnerships, that we work together with people, that we try as often as we can in every instance to reduce the power differentials. So for example, for a medical provider going in to see a resident or patient, or a staff member, or an older individual seeing a younger patient, that we do everything we can, or differences perceived with race or identity, that we seek to approach each other with a common humanness and a sharing of power, that we don't have power over with someone, we have power with someone. This principle includes the concept of doing with a person rather than to them or even for them. And it certainly includes shared decision making. So again, no doubt, I'm sure you're seeing the correlation here with person-centered care. The next principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. This is really founded in self-determination. In other words, the right to make your own decisions, which really is, I think, one of the strongest resident rights. Recognizing every person's experience is unique. Even with the pandemic, or if I have 8 people living with dementia, I have 8 different people, 8 different experiences of that same diagnosis. Empowerment, voice, and choice includes asking permission, sharing decision-making, and goal setting, that we really focus on people's strengths. And I have a whole segment just on that. I love that. Self-advocacy skills, that we have a universal cultural belief in resilience and recovery, and a sense of hope for the future. Boy, and don't we all need that right now with this pandemic. The last one is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So this is self-awareness of the unconscious bias, the stigma, racism, discrimination, the stereotypes, that we become more aware. And I'm seeing more and more organizations and communities with diversity, equity, and inclusion work groups and policies, that we no longer ignore the historical trauma, the events experienced by the collective community, but experienced personally for, like I mentioned before, the Holocaust, slavery, genocide, victimization, and oppression. that we recognize the healing value of traditional cultural connections, avoiding judgments and no assumptions, approaching, some people say, well, we have to be culturally competent, and I have a different view on that we approach with a cultural curiosity and cultural humility, that I don't know so much about other people's cultures, and rather than try to learn all of that and stuff all these facts and things in my mind, what is better to do is to ask them, can you teach me about what's important to you with your culture? So in offering gender responsive services. So this is so important as we have more experience and interaction with LGBTQ and transgender, that we are more welcoming and we have services that respect those differences and honor and uphold those. So those were the principles, very high-level overview. Now we have something that are called the key assumptions, and there are 4 of them. They happen to all start with the letter R, so we call those the 4 R's. Realizing the widespread impact of trauma and appreciating that there are paths to recovery. That's for all of us, residents, patients, families, all of us as staff. Again, this whole video series, this is just the beginning. This is the foundation. Recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, respond, and that includes responding based on our policies, our procedures, and our practices, and that we actively resist re-traumatization. So again, if you want to think about what does trauma-informed care look like, if you can think of the 6 principles, the 4 R's, really what I've given to you right now is, in a nutshell, the essence of what trauma-informed care will look like as you begin to adapt and adopt these ideas and principles into your own culture. It's very important that we lose the idea that becoming a trauma-informed care organization, it's just something that's going to happen one day. We'll never get there. It's not something on a checklist that we say, oh, we did it, done, what's the next thing? Everyone, this is an ongoing process, that even a culture that has done magnificent work in becoming trauma-informed, there's always more to be done. So it's a journey. It is not something to be assigned to one person or one department. It's everybody all of the time, and I mean everybody. So it's a fluid, ongoing process and literally has no end date. We will never accomplish it. It's something that we just need to begin incorporating and doing in our daily interactions. The challenge, however, and this is from someone who's worked in and around nursing homes, like I said, for almost 30 years, is that when CMS says to our nursing homes, you will become trauma-informed, we don't have any guidance quite yet. So we're all doing our very best to figure out, what does that mean? What does it look like? And how do we do it? And I've always had this urge and the urgency that we've got to do something and do it now. And what I've seen in many different organizations is that we tend to want to jump to action and implement a tool or a new form. And I'm going to ask us to slow down. Let's not just jump in. I've had some facilities say, well, we're trauma-informed. We do this particular tool or assessment or screening tool. It's not just that. It's not a tool. So we're going to get to those in a little while in another video, but for the moment, I'm going to ask you to consider doing something, if you've not already done it in your particular community, is assess your facility capacity to screen for trauma. There's a few things that go along with that. For example, determining what services are available. This is internal and external. You may have some expertise right in your own facility. Some people with training and expertise in trauma-informed care or trauma-informed care counseling. What's available in your immediate community? What's available telephonically? How ready is your facility? And I'm going to show some examples of how to look at that to implement this, to begin to implement it. And then what are the staff's perceptions? Because it's really, really important to understand how staff think about and understand trauma-informed care, and if they are ready to embark upon this, because we can't just give it to people and say, we will do this now. We really do have to have everyone's buy-in and agreement to do this. The super good news is that we already are doing some aspects of this. There's very much a connection between trauma-informed care and person-centered care. So good news, we are doing some of it already, and we're just going to continue to expand. One of the tools that is available to you as you consider looking at your own facility, a facility-wide assessment. This is a document, and I've just done a screenshot here. The link is right here at the bottom. This is something that you could use to stimulate discussion. So if you'll notice here, look at the top. These are the key principles that I just briefly went over. And then there are 10 domains. So across all of the principles, this document provides a series of questions for you to begin to evaluate your own facility's preparedness and readiness to begin this journey of becoming trauma-informed. The trauma-informed organizational model planning. So basically, this is another resource that I just think is wonderful. I want to just mention it to you. I'm not including all of these. The link to this really great resource is right here at the bottom. It's free. What this resource does, it has a series of charts in the appendix. And what it does is it goes through all of these different topics and provides a worksheet for you to begin to look at, okay, in terms of leading and communicating or hiring, where are we at? What are our strengths? What are the opportunities for improvement? So I really liked this resource because it really went into a deeper dive into multiple different areas. And as you can see, trauma-informed care is across every department, every policy, everything that we do. So another great resource for you to take a look at. Here's one more. This is the Trauma-Informed Climate Scale 10, because there's 10 questions. It's TICS 10 is what you might hear it as. Now, I have used this tool before a few different times, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. When I said to you that you need to consider staff's perceptions of their experience of trauma or trauma-informed principles in your facility, in their work environment, this is one of the ways that you can go about learning about their perceptions. Sometimes things like the trauma-informed care principles, like safety and trustworthiness and collaboration and transparency, those can be hard to measure. Those can be hard to kind of figure out. So I do like this tool. The risk that we run here is that if you use this tool, you are basically asking your staff to share some very personal information, their perceptions on some very, if you look at the first question, I feel like I have a great deal of control over my job satisfaction, or the leadership listens only to their favorite employees. You know, those are sensitive questions, and they're important questions. But when you ask those, you've got to really decide, are you ready to do something with that information? So I've done this survey in 2 different facilities, and we had long conversations with the administrative staff to make sure that when we did this, that they were prepared to act on what staff told them. Because the perceptions, we're asking for people's perceptions. So really, with that particular tool, the TICS 10, a high trauma-informed care culture is one that is doing more to uphold the principles of trauma-informed care, whereas a low trauma-informed culture might be struggling a bit more. So this scale focuses only on staff perceptions, and that's really important because if the staff perceive that leadership only listens to their favorite employees or that their work environment is not safe, we have to act on those perceptions, no matter what we think it is, okay? The TICS 10 ultimately measures the extent to which employee rights, freedoms, and contributions are valued, and research has demonstrated how the prioritization of these values can contribute to the overall success. So, important tool, but I always encourage people, go in this with your eyes wide open and be prepared. So what I want to, I'm going to show you in the next slide. When I did this tool with one facility. I think it was 240 some staff members. The other one, we did a very small sample. Some of the things that bubbled up with this and that the administration then had to figure out what to do, I transformed those results into questions. So for example, what would you do if a majority of staff respond they do not believe that the organization cares whether staff gets what they need to do their job well? That was the case in one of the facilities, that the overwhelming majority of staff really felt that. What would you do if a significant segment of staff respond they don't know where they stand, if they disagree with administration? Or what happens if a few people report they are uncomfortable with a coworker? So one of the examples, we did this, and it was a very small number of people that were struggling with a coworker, but you still have to decide, do I spend my time there? What are the struggles? How do I intervene? Do I intervene? So, you know, not insurmountable questions, but you need to be aware. This concludes the foundation presentation in this trauma-informed care video series, but I will end each of the videos with this slide. Action steps. By next Monday, what will you do? Who will you share information with? So begin thinking about the next steps so we don't just leave this information on a slide or in a video series. But we really start thinking, how can I use this information? What will I do next? So I thank you for sharing your time with me. There are 2 more slides after this ending slide. My full bio is, modified bio is here. And then just to say thank you to the project sponsors, the Care Compass Network and the Finger Lakes Geriatric Education Center. So thank you for your time.